Hello, Tom Lavecchia here with the latest edition of the New Theory podcast. Today we have our second Emmy winner, and I almost won an Emmy. If I can tell that story a little later, but I want to introduce Jen Maxfield. She's the author of More After Break: A Reporter Returns to 10 Unforgettable News Stories. If you're in the New York area, you know who Jen is. She's a phenomenal reporter. She worked her way up through the ranks, and now she is soon to be, I believe, a best-selling author. Again, she anchored in NBC or anchors in NBC since Eyewitness News, ABC. Again, if you're in the tri-state area, you know who she is. This is a really exciting interview for me. Jen, welcome to the New Theory Podcast. How you doing today?
Tom, this is an exciting interview for me too. So thank you so much for having me on and for that very kind introduction. I like that you said I worked my way up through the ranks. I think that's true.
Well, you did. I mean, like I said, it's obviously, everybody knows this, but going to go super local, but, Channel 11 with WPIX type thing, that's like super local, wasn't a nationally affiliated, as I understand, and which is super important, right? But now you're on NBC, which although, is national, but you're in the New York, which is the creme de la creme. So like the cool thing is you have insight or have insight to news stories, late breaking news, and that kind of stuff. So first I want to ask you, what an Emmy, if you don't mind me asking, well, what was that for?
Yeah, sure. And just to get back to how I worked my way up, I actually did not work for Pix. My first job was in Binghamton, New York. Local news is kind of like minor league baseball.
Got it.
You start in the smaller cities, and then ideally you work your way up to the bigger ones. So my first job was in Binghamton, New York, WIBT News Channel 34. Then went from there to Syracuse, New York, where I worked for News Channel 9, WIXT. And then I actually went from Syracuse to Eyewitness News in New York. Was there?
Oh, right. I'm sorry. That's right. I meant Eyewitness, not Pix. Forgive me. I grew up, like I said, 5 channels: ABC, NBC, CBS, WOR9, and WPIX. So I got those conflated, but I got it, Jen, and I appreciate that.
It's all good. And to answer your question, the Emmy, which I won in 2018, was for spot news coverage. There was a small plane crash that happened right near Teterboro Airport in an industrial park. And the photographer who I was working with that day and I happened to be right near the scene. And we were the first crew to be able to get right next to where the plane had gone down. And so we won what's called a spot news Emmy for that, which basically means getting to a scene of something that's just happened, breaking into programming and reporting on it.
Now, working in your space is highly competitive, and you kind of brought it up earlier. So you kind of go from the farm team, which you're like local affiliates, but very few break through to the next level. Again, being on NBC, in New York is like kind of saying, hey, I'm playing with affiliates. I don't with the Yankees, what was your strategy in terms of, your career trajectory, and, what are some of the ways you were able to kind of, did you work your butt off, or you had a lot of inside sources? I want to kind of, set this up as to why you wrote the book, but give us some of the secrets of your success so far.
Sure. So I'm going to date myself by telling you this story, but when I was first looking for my on-air job, it was the year 2000. So This is before YouTube, before social media. So the way
before HD, right?
Yes, there was color TV back then.
No, but I'm saying the reason being, and this is going to sound terrible because I have friends in the space. I had a friend who was religiously on QVC, right? And go out to Pennsylvania and everything else. And what happened was when HDB came around, it knocked half the people out of the box, because like you really saw how they looked, and not being a jerk, but you saw everything, and it just, some people weren't secure about it. Some people just didn't look as good. So like, I know the HDD revolution was kind of like big in that space.
Well, this is way before that. So anyway, I'm getting my graduate degree from Columbia. I had worked off air for CNN for a few years as a production assistant.
I like how you casually, journalism from Columbia. We'll get to that. 'Cause that's a big
All
deal.
right, but listen to this story,
Yeah.
because I think it's good to talk about the hustle.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
yes, I work for NBC now and it's great, but I
Yeah.
think that it's really important to tell people about the hustle and that I
Absolutely.
didn't just land here. So anyway, so I'm graduating from Columbia Journalism School. Back in the day, we used to have to put our resume reel on VHS tapes and
Yes.
then copy the tape over and over and over in those 2-deck VHS
Yeah, to put them
machines,
in and
right?
yeah.
So, and then you'd have to take your hard-earned money, go to the post office and mail out these tapes. So, true story, in the spring and summer of 2000, I put together what I thought was a pretty good resume tape.
Yeah.
And I mailed out 65 copies of it.
Wow.
65 with
Wow.
my name, my phone number, my email address, my resume, which I thought was pretty good.
Yeah.
You know how many calls I got back, Tom?
How many?
0.
Yikes.
0. Crickets. Nobody. So what I decided to do was I leaned into my network, which I've always done and continue to do.
Of course.
And I called a few people who I knew who were a few years ahead of me and working in small markets, and several people recommended taking a road trip and just figuring out where you want to work, put some pins on the map,
I like
and
that.
take a road trip to that region. And then once you're in the town or you're going to be there the next day, then call the news director and say, hey, I happen to be in town. Do you have 10 minutes to meet with me? And that was the secret sauce. It was, and typically at that time, when you would go into a news director's office for an interview, the VHS tapes would be stacked 10, 12, 20 high in the news director's office. So you had a visual the minute you walked in there of exactly how many other people wanted the job and how many tapes this person probably had 30 seconds to watch each. You knew the competition the minute you walked in for the interview.
So there's a good learning to unpack here. So I it's funny, and I do not, Jen, and I should. So I started a podcast truly out of survival. I own a magazine called newtheory.com. Publishing's a rough space, and I had to fire my whole staff. This is a long story, but just didn't work out, right, financially. Because, publishing is very hard, especially if you don't have a visual medium. So I just, what am I good at? I'm good at talking, I think, right? So I started a podcast to keep the content flowing, and it kind of worked out. My secondary metric was to leverage business relationships, right? So this. I'll have, like Jeff Hoffman, he's a billionaire, one of the founders on the Booking.com, Priceline.com team. So just for craps and giggles, I had somebody reach out and say, hey, what's a consulting assignment for you, blah, blah, blah. And it was like, not just him, I did a few different people. And it was like $10,000 just to kind of meet with you type of thing, right? Because this guy's a billionaire, right? But then I reach out separately, not him, but I don't want to blow up the spot, but I reach out to him directly. And I said, hey, you want to be the podcast? It was a snap yes, right? So it's like, well, wait a second. If you want to talk professionally about the similar things we're going to talk about, I'm going to say no. I can't afford you there, but and nor would I have the money to pay it. But you'll come on almost for free to have a podcast conversation, just similar to you. Like rather than you be on that cattle call, why not offer something? Hey, I'm from another affiliate. I want to chat with the director, maybe interview you. You know how it is, right? I have some stories for you. So I think the key there is to offer value up front without asking anything in return. And then slowly you'll start to win and start to gain your network. Even if that person, like, Jen, I don't have anything for you, right? But let's keep in touch. And then that could be a referral source or a hire later on. So I love that. I love that strategy on how you did it, right? What was your first big break?
The first big break I got was getting that first job in Binghamton.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I was hired at WIVT News Channel 34, the number 154 market in the Nielsen rankings. And I was hired in July of 2000, so almost 22 years ago. Yeah. I was hired as a general assignment reporter, but within 2 months, I became the main anchor for the 6 and 11 p.m. newscasts. And I had a great mentor there in Steve Craig, who was my co-anchor. He'd been there for a long time. And I just learned. I made mistakes. I did some terrible live shots where I stumbled or forgot what I was going to say. But I also learned a lot. And then within a year, they had transferred me to another station in the same station group, which was in Syracuse, New York. And again, a great learning experience, but you make mistakes along the way, and that's how you learn.
To dovetail that too is you sought some mentorship, which again, strategy, networking, having a mentor. I think the mentor protege relationship these days are lacking, and it's funny because we have much easier ways to communicate. But I think people are not seeking out mentorship, and frankly, I think a lot of mentors are not taking on as many proteges just for whatever reason. I just think people don't think it's as cool. But I think you should have multiple mentors, and then that will help you in your career and in life. All right, so that was your first big break. Kind of move along. Now you're in a big market, right? So you obviously, so you obviously were experienced, right? So when you made your way over to NBC, right? Were you confident you were good, or were you still a little nervous early on because it was kind of the big show, or was a big show?
I'm always nervous. I'm nervous, and I think it's good to talk about that because I think it's good to be honest.
Yeah.
And I was nervous before I started this podcast with you today. I'm nervous before I go speak in front of a room full of people.
Yeah.
I'm nervous before I get up in front of my class at Columbia Journalism School. And when I say nervous, I don't mean that I'm scared. I mean that I have that anticipation of wanting to do well.
Yeah.
And wanting to do my best. And I think when you stop getting nervous and
Yep.
you stop getting excited, that you kind of lose your edge. And I think that idea of just wanting to do your best and really feeling like you're pumped to go do something and do it to the highest level that you can, I think that's what keeps you hungry. And that's just the energy that I bring to things. I try to always try to keep pushing things forward and never get complacent. And I think that's why I continue to be nervous for all of these opportunities that I have.
Now I got to ask you a possibly controversial question. Really not, may not be, depending how you would look at it. And then I want to deep dive into the book. So myself, right? I still, like I said, I grew up in 5 channels. So I still value tremendously NBC, ABC, especially CBS. But I'm also, more podcasting now, have my own podcast. I like Joe Rogan. I like a lot of the true crime stuff. So a lot of like my share of mine is being diverted away from traditional news media. Now, luckily you're in with a company that gets it, right? Comcast gets it. They have different streams. They have, I think they're working on their own streaming network. There's all these things. Luckily you're in the right company. So if you stay where you're at, you'll be seen more. But in general, though, the traditional local news is getting crushed because of these other mediums. So you as Jen Maxfield, what do? Do you kind of, hey, I love where I'm at, and these guys and gals are doing the right thing by doing streaming, and they'll get me the more exposure? Or are you thinking maybe starting your own podcast? I don't want to jam you up, but you get what I'm saying. Like, there's a lot of new mediums that you can get out there and express yourself. That does include NBC, but you could also do on your own or in other ways. What's your strategy for the kind of the next level to bring Jen to the next level?
Yeah, I think you hit on an important point. I think that I'm in a great place right now being with NBC because I think NBC is thinking beyond some of the more traditional delivery methods. I mean, we're doing a lot of things on social media. As you mentioned, we're streaming. I think we're really in a place where we can meet viewers where they are. If they want to watch my story on the subway on the commute to work, that's great. If they want to click into it through their Twitter feed, that's also great. So I would push back a little bit on what you said about people feeling like they're moving away from local media. So much of my book is actually about the importance and how integral local media is to communities. And I think that we see that more and more, that when you have reporters and journalists who are from the community and are covering the community where they live, we really have a personal investment in letting other people know what's going on.
True.
We're not just parachuting in to do stories. We live here.
Well, you're right. I mean, so, if you were to, I'll give you that. If you were to, how do I say this? If you were to say, hey, you know what? I'm done with traditional TV, right? I noticed NBC still streams on Sling, and so you're right. So I guess I conflated the medium with the content. You get what I'm saying? So I guess if Jen Maxfield is continuing to report on local news and NBC does a good job at getting on the different platforms, that's more important, right? To get the content and then the streaming, where I sometimes conflate and say, well, wait a second, some people aren't really consuming local news, but they are traditional TV, but they are consuming it in other ways. So you're right. Just as long as you get to the cord cutters, right, and people that there's some people that and CNBC, which is I know a sister channel, does a good job where some of their shows are direct to podcast. So even though it's visual, you could actually go on the CNBC iTunes and listen in on shows because you're driving or just don't have an appetite to watch TV. So I agree with you on that. All right. So Jen, you have a successful career. You're doing well for yourself. More after the break. Why write the book? Because it's always interesting. I wrote a book somewhere around here. It was a bestseller on Amazon. It's not easy. It's a labor of love. Why write the book, Jen?
I love to write. So I want to start there. I think it's funny. Some people have asked me, oh, did you actually write it yourself? And I said, yes, I wrote every word.
You're an author too, huh?
Pardon me?
I had a ghostwriter, man. I didn't write my book. So you wrote your own book.
I wrote every word, and I really enjoyed it. Some days I feel like I was pulling my hair out because the words weren't coming out right. But I want to show you something. This little Post-it here, this is where I wrote most of the book in this home office. This says, I had it on my desktop the whole time. It says, you can't really read it, but it says out of comfort zone.
I love that.
And I had this as my visual, as sort of my intention throughout the process, because I felt that I always wanted to write a book. And I will tell you that the people who I've covered over the years, I've interviewed more than 10,000 people.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Over the last 22 years. And some people have really stayed with me. A lot of people, way more than just the 10 who were covered in the book, have really stayed with me. And I would think about them. Sometimes I dream about them. So they were definitely in my subconscious. And I had the idea to write a book in the back of my head, but I think it really came to the forefront when I started teaching at Columbia. And there's something about teaching what you do for work that makes you analyze what you do in a different way. And so I started outlining and sort of taking some rough notes on the stories that I might want to return to and the people I might want to catch up with. And that really formed the genesis, or like the seed of the idea that grew with the book.
Jen, you can appreciate this. I'm in for like 450 shows all in, and some of those with the co-hosts. So probably individually, I'm probably in for about 380-ish of people interviewed, nowhere near 10,000. You kind of take away a little bit from each. We're selfish in a way. And what I mean by selfish is we learn, we listen. It's like a free education for us. And it makes us better people because you kind of live and learn. But I got to tell you, one thing I take away from you is your humbleness. I will explain this. If I graduated from Columbia and then I taught from Columbia, I would have a hat, a shirt, a sign. Like I would have Columbia across my forehead. But I like the fact that like you're more focused on the content and your work product than your own accomplishment. So I don't want to go into a lot of the stories. I want people to read the book, but I did pick one out that kind of was a little special to me. Paul Esposito, tell us a little bit about Paul and kind of a little bit of his journey.
Sure. So people may remember back in 2003, there was a crash of the Staten Island ferry. It was going from Lower Manhattan to Staten Island. And the person who was at the controls had taken some pain medication the night before, and he passed out at the controls. And the ferry, instead of going into the normal slip at St. George Terminal, it actually sideswiped a concrete maintenance pier at full speed. So it was a horrendous accident. And the person who I interviewed just 2 days after the Staten Island ferry crash was a young man named Paul Esposito, and he was 24 years old. He grew up on Staten Island and had been working at a restaurant as a waiter in Manhattan, and he had worked the lunch shift and was heading home. And he was coming down from the top deck to the lower deck when the ferry crashed, and both of his legs were spontaneously amputated. It was really a horrific injury. Wow. And the title of the chapter on him is Angel on the Ferry, because it just so happened that there was a nurse from the UK who was on the ferry. Wow. She was in New York to sightsee, and she saw what had happened to Paul, and she stopped and she helped him, and she put tourniquets on his legs and commandeered a belt from another commuter in order to stop the bleeding. And then it took 20 minutes to get the ferry back into the slip to allow the paramedics to come on board. And Carrie really fought for Paul and fought for the paramedics to take him, even though it looked like he was almost dead. And she is the sole reason he's alive today. And he was the first patient to get to the hospital. And really just an incredible story of someone thrust into an extraordinary circumstance, and also just the journey that both Paul and Carrie took after the initial accident, what has happened in the 17 years since then.
Wow. And this is just one of 10 stories. You don't have to be from New York and New Jersey. These are anywhere. We do have a good representation. We actually have a good international audience as well. You can get on your local Amazon because the book is everywhere. I say this, and if I'm going to say this for you, Jen, I hope you don't mind. You're welcome to disagree. You didn't need to write this book. And here's what I mean. You have a successful career. You got a great life. You self-authored the book. It's to do all that, it takes away from your career, it takes away from your family, your friends, and that kind of stuff. And it's really a labor of love. Don't get me wrong, this is going to be a commercial success, going to bring you to the next level. But I really think you did it because it was in your heart. You know what I mean? So we're going to be wrapping up soon, and I'm going to have a link to a book below. Please make sure you pick it up. But my question to you, Jen, is what was the tipping point to write the book? Because the stories are up here, right? You had some stories. What was a tipping point where you said, I need to memorialize it?
I think that we've all read a lot of books about where the journalist is at the center of the book and the journalist is the narrator. And I think what's interesting about this book is that the center of every story is the person. And I think it was important for the general public to understand that we're not just calling people or quoting their tweets or writing stories on people we've never met. We're actually sitting in people's living rooms and speaking with them. And sometimes in Paul's case, sitting at the side of his hospital bed and speaking with people on some of the worst, most traumatic, most chaotic days of their lives. And I just felt it was important that people know that we as journalists, we don't forget about them when we move on to the next news story. They stay in our heads. They stay in our hearts. And I don't think I'm unique in thinking this. I think a lot of journalists get into the business because they care about people and because they feel they enjoy meeting new people and they want to learn from people. And I think that this book is just a reflection and a deeper dive into what it's like to be with people on these days, and also how much happens after we move on to the next story.
And that's kind of where the magic happens, because it also influences you as a journalist, right? Like your 10,000th and first story, you treat much differently than you did. I have a little one.
I have 3 kids myself. Yeah. I know all about it.
Yeah, I have 3, and a 4th is about to crown. So
that's wonderful.
In the LaVecchia household.
Nice.
So before we conclude, I want to know, maybe again, you don't have to get the whole story, but like now I kind of get a feeling for why you wrote the book. What were midstream, right? You picked which stories, which you picked. Which story kind of jumps out briefly that inspired you the most?
So just one note in case any of your listeners are thinking of writing a book. I did not have a precise outline that I followed to a T, or that I
120 pages or 240 pages. Now I know, like it usually is.
And I would also say that even like the 10 stories that wound up in the book, I didn't have all of those figured out on day one. Wow. I started writing the book and frankly wasn't even sure that the whole project would work until I was about halfway done with it. Right. So that's another note on the hustle. It's just not always so. It seems very neat and organized now, but in the moment, it really wasn't. I think the one relationship that's just worth taking a look at is the one that I had with Corinne Nellius, who's Tiffany Jantel's mom. She's the subject of chapter 3. And Tiffany was a young woman. She just turned 23 years old, and she was trying to save a dog that had been hit by a car in the middle of the road. And she got out. This happened in central New Jersey. She got out to try to help the dog and wound up getting hit herself by a person who a judge later said had been drinking at a bar, though that was never proven. But anyway, it was a horrible story. And Tiffany was a wonderful young woman. And her mom and I really bonded the day that I interviewed her because it was a hit and run. She invited us into her home because they were hoping to arrest the person who had killed Tiffany. But Corrine and I have stayed in touch these last 11 years. And so I knew from keeping in touch with Corrine what she was going through as a mom who'd lost a child in sort of this public way because it became a news story because of the criminal aspect of it.
Yeah.
But it made me wonder what had happened to the people who I didn't keep in touch with, the people who I'd interviewed even before there was social media for me to have a way to keep in touch with them. So she was a big inspiration in my deciding to move forward with the book.
Nice. And like I said, you can get the book on Amazon. I did a little research pretty much on anywhere you can get your major books. Barnes & Noble, BN.com, and so forth. Jen Maxfield, more after the break, a reporter returns to 10 unforgettable news stories. So Jen, I'll give you the final word. Just gives, I guess, maybe the parting words, and we'll wrap it up.
Tom, I want to thank you so much for having me. I want to thank you to all your listeners and viewers for tuning in. And I think people might also enjoy the behind the scenes aspect of the book. So I'll end on a light note. And I just want to thank all the people who we've met out in the field over the years who have offered us a warm cup of coffee, a bathroom to use when we're on an assignment. We really do appreciate our viewers and the community. We love it when people come up to the live truck and say hello. So anyway, thank you for your interest in the project. It means a lot.
It's my pleasure. Check out the book, put a link below. Thank you for being on the New Theory Podcast.